Yes, Megha.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megha Kumari, and I am research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies. It is with great pleasure that I extend a warm and humble welcome to another edition of the ICSS Wednesday seminar titled "From Old to New: Tere Ghar Ke Samne and Fractious Neighborships in 1962." Traditionally, the history of India and China as a neighbor has been seen more in terms of conflict about territory or ideology. The India China War of 1962 played out on the edges of nation boundaries reached to people's minds, mostly through media like radio, newspapers, and later movies. One particular Hindi movie from 1963 titled Tere Ghar Ke Samne, translated as In Front of Your House, tells a love story set in a newly developed areas of New Delhi, reflecting on the strained relationships between neighbors. This movie prompts us to think about what an imaginative kind of history might look like if we use movies as sources, focusing on how neighboring countries are portrayed. The movie highlights the post-war period's struggles through imagined pasts and futures. Rather than dwelling on the war's losses, it prompts us to think about the present and future crises and the possibilities for shared and colonial and post-colonial futures. The seminar, in the light of details as mentioned, delves into how cinematic sources provide an alternative framework to approach history. The speaker for today's session is Ms. Navnidhi Sharma, who is a doctoral candidate in cinema studies at New York University. Her research thesis traces an imaginative history of India and China through Hindi films. Her work is located in the intersection of film history and the connected history of India-China, placing at its center the cinematic imagination, discursive media space, and the material processes and conditions of film production. The chair for today's seminar is Professor Patricia Oberoi, who is an emeritus fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. She has also served as the chairperson of the ICS. Her research focuses on the aspects of family, kinship, gender, popular culture, and social policy with respect to both India and China. She has co-authored the BCIM Forum and Regional Integration, at the institute at the ICS, she has been closely associated for several years with the Bangladesh China India Myanmar Forum for Regional Cooperation, a track to dialogue focusing on development issues in a region stretching from northeast India to southwest China. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All the participants are requested to remain muted during the seminar. You may post your questions in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. I now hand over to the chair to take the proceedings further. Over to you, Professor Oberoi. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mega, for that introduction. And I can only say that I'm absolutely delighted to be here in the chair at this moment. Many of us have fond memories of Navnidhi in her previous incarnation in the Ministry of External Affairs in the East Asian section, where she had the awful responsibility at one stage of minding the rest of us, who were not exactly cut and tailored to the ministry requirements for discreet diplomacy. But she threw herself into this particular work, which has already been mentioned, going on at the time, the ambitious or the BCIM project, which has not, after many meetings, has not been continued, but which at one stage, when things were all looking pretty bonny, they held a road rally from Calcutta to Kunming. And she was one of the participants in this, and along with Mr. Ravi Bhuttalingam, who is here, many others, and it was quite an adventure. Watched and, as it were, not watched in those days, but listened to as they stopped at various places along the long route. Now, at some stage or other, Navnidhi seemed to have decided that she wanted a different sort of life. And if I might say so, I'm so glad about that as well, because what she's going to present to us today, I was thinking, is what I would call a feast of ideas, as well as a complete adventure in methodology. In ICS seminars, we don't often talk about methodology. This was something that in my many years at the Institute of Economic Growth, the economists were always the first question. And I have a question about your methodology, it would go, and it was all to me about arithmetic of some sort, classification and arithmetic. But never mind, this is methodology in the true sense of the word, the way to get down to dealing with a problem. And I won't say more, but except to say that this problem has been around for a very, well, since 1962. That's a long time, isn't it? And it is often summed up about what's wrong in India-China relations. And the answer very often given is that there is a mistrust or a trust factor. Indians don't trust China, and we don't get so much publicity from the other side, but I'm sure there are people here who, at present, who, with their own documentary evidence, could show us that Chinese don't trust Indians either. So, and this has been, ever since I began to think about this, I used to wonder, as a sociologist, how you study something like that. What you're studying is popular perceptions, and then where they come from, and how they're produced, and then how they are reproduced to become, as it were, the truths or the understandings that many people or most people live by. And the question I used to ask myself in olden days was, how and where do we locate this? Well, a very obvious way is what is going on all the time around us, which is opinion polls. And these are now sort of an international global business. So all over the world, people are framing questionnaires to for different types of people, deciding what are the possible relevant factors, asking individuals, what do you think of China, or what do you think of India, or do you have a positive impression of such and such? If not, why not? And they give you some options. And these have turned into, a complete global industry, which is supposed to be incredibly meaningful for international relations going forth. But I always felt, yes, such things are necessary, but are they only the one obvious and rather superficial type of getting to what this is all about? And there are other things that one should perhaps look at. And one is what happens between in the reproduction of views, perceptions, and so on, like mistrust, or how is it all institutionalized? And one thing and how does it change over time? And in a population, who thinks this way and who thinks that way? Well, in the 1990s, there was very interesting work going on, not about China, hardly at all, China-India relations, but about India and Pakistan. And there was a huge social science industry there, which wanted to find out what do you look at when you want to know this? And one thing that people looked at, well, one was publications, all right, review the literature. Another might be to look at because you're wondering how ideas are reproduced, how they're produced, say, through school textbooks. And there is a big, there was quite a lot of work, really interesting work done by educationists on India and Pakistan. And of course, that means partition, independence, and subsequent conflicts, and boundary disputes, of course, and how this comes across in textbooks. And other ways of looking at it are through, of course, newspapers, media, nowadays social media, and also fictional works, namely movies, which are so powerful in most of the countries concerned. Well, I began to think about this literature, India, Pak, and where these prejudices and ideas came from. And I thought, well, all right, that can be done for China. One can look at how China is taught in social science textbooks across the country. And I must say that at one stage, I made quite an effort to look at social science textbooks and where China was in history, politics, political science, and other sociology, maybe other social sciences. And really, it was very, very poor, very little, very poor, and not at all as interesting as what you can find on India-Pakistan relations, where you also have, of course, short stories, fiction, poetry, and cinema. So predictably, the 1962 was an explosion or development of the mistrust factor, and the mistrust factor has not gone away. And one thing that people have tried to do, myself included, is look at a few films that refer to this period. I myself had looked at first Dr. Coates, the film on Dr. Coates back in the 40s. I'd looked at other films post 1962, like what am I trying to say? The most famous one I've written on at great length.
Hakikat.
Hakikat, right? The most famous, the most rich and famous. And one could go on to other things. And someone has, a former well-wisher of Chinese studies in India and of this institute, Kunor Kripalani, has exactly taken these three films one by one and into the new era. And what she does is she starts with the film. So there we have our series. And then she takes the period, yes, the flush of newly developing nations, then the conflict between some of these erstwhile partners, and finally into the age of globalization, modernization, and so on. But this, in a way, leaves a lot unsaid. And I myself, as I said, had taken up two of these themes and certainly found a lot to talk about in different ways with reference to genre and other things. Now, what we have in front of us today with Navnidhi is something which is completely different. It's a real experiment in methodology, completely different to what is now presently existing. And this is because she is talking about relating, if you like, the India-China conflict to a film which has nothing to do with that, is a sort of family romance or whatever you like to say, and doesn't refer to the conflict, and is all about neighborliness. It is a different genre, a different work, a different set of critiques. But what does it have to say about this conflict? I think that, as I said, is a real adventure in methodology. And I think she's going to lay it out now before us. And we can see that there are many different routes to the same thing, except pegging your landmarks on the, the events between nations in international relations, and literatures or films or discourses that go with that, and something which is not about that, yet was made along with it and is really offering lots of food for thought. So with that much, I'll say thank you very much. Let's see what, in a supposedly secular piece of work, a potboiler of sorts with star participation, this particular effort is going to show us. Thank you so much for Navnidhi for bringing this here. As I said, it's a real mind teaser, and it's about time our minds were teased. So thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be joining you and all of the others here at ICS. This presentation is part of my dissertation. Actually, it started as an article that I was writing. And then since I had spent months and months writing it and had nothing, to show for my dissertation writing, I said, well, you know what, this fits right well into my dissertation. It should just become a chapter then. But it is, as I go through this, many of you may realize it's very much a work in progress. And for that reason, and always I welcome thoughts and questions. More broadly, as Megha said, I'm trying to write a film history of India and China. And this disciplinary interlocution has its challenges because cinema is unlike conventional sources of historical writings. It circulates in commercial and affective economies and has, at best, unstable evidentiary value. And so this requires accounting for cinema's own industrial histories in its intersections with wider historical sweeps. But what I hope to get at the end of this is an imaginative history of India and China, not things as they happened or the strategic side of things, but just in imaginations and in questions around history. In today's presentation, I thought about, what's my central argument? I think my argument is that in this film, Tere Ghar Ke Samne, in this film that was made over a period of 5 to 6 months after the war, because this film captures the unraveling of a historical narrative around non-violence. And it does so in a way that it transposes this unraveling through its contemplation of a Delhi, the city of Delhi, moving from old to new. So I'll be sharing a PowerPoint from here on. Sorry, just a second. Sorry, I think that will take me a moment. Okay, so I'll start from what I'm sure most of us here already know. India and China fought a short but intense war over 33 days in the winter of 1962. The Indian army met with swift and decisive defeat, found inadequately prepared for war and the harsh natural elements of the Himalayan regions. Since then, the war has become a teleological endpoint for several written histories of modern India and China. Arunabh Ghosh notes how these narratives evoke high politics and narrowly conceived diplomatic histories are usually recounted through a well-worn listing of terms from international relations. Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, the Panchsheel, the Bandung Conference of 1955, Tibet and Dalai Lama's flight to India in 59, escalating border agreements through the decade, and finally overshadowing them all, the War of 1962. Of these, the Panchsheel, the 5 principles of mutual coexistence, is relevant for our discussion today. But to take the war as a subject of film and media history we are reminded that it was fought on the fringes of national geographies and imaginations in the Himalayas. So it reached most Indian publics through radio, print, and eventually cinema. In turning to film and its surrounding ecologies of print publication, we can pay attention to the mediations that steep this processing and the memory of events from 1962 in a public imagination. The 1964 film Hakikat, which means reality, shot on location and with the assistance of the Indian Ministry of Defense, captured the Indian defeat in the stark and inhospitable landscapes. By its very title, Hakikat makes historiographic, aesthetic, and ideological claims to the representation of the India-China War. And over time, it has acquired the aura of India's first and most prominent war film. It captures the loss of young lives, the human cost to war, and as Professor Oberoi argues in her paper, the imagined loss of possibility of a union of India with its racial, ethnic, religious, and other borderlands. And so this tragic decimation of outnumbered Indian soldiers forms the definitive cinematic image of the period, a quote-unquote freeze frame that makes the war and its cinematic representation a mutually reinforcing historical narrative that obscures all other histories of the period and of contemporary cinema in relation to it. A breezy romance set in the wide and leafy, imagined in literal geographies of post-partition New Delhi, the 63 Navketan production about love between the children of feuding neighbours, Tere Ghar Ke Samne, is an unlikely candidate for the exploration of the India-China War. The film played for over 3 months at Roxy Cinema in Bombay, though critical reception was lukewarm. The Times of India pronounced it neither excellent nor execrable, while complimenting its gentle, rather sophisticated script and direction. The filmfare critic was harder to please, finding the architect hero who frolics about, goes on picnics, spends long hours at nightclubs lacking depth. Only Mother India gave the film generous assessment as an excellent fare for a rainy evening when life at home becomes too sticky and life in the street too wet. The reviews, however, are unanimous in establishing the film as a comedy, bearing little relation or consequence for the world outside its screen, barring an occasional reading of the film as a parable for partition because it's about neighbors. It remains in popular memory a frothy romance and a comedy. I ask what alternative interpretations, less easy to digest and dismiss, can be elicited by reframing the film within its historical time. This film first drew my attention as an allegorical curiosity because of a resemblance between its theme of neighbourly conflict that nebulously reflected a similar narrative around the India-China War. The interest was piqued when contemporary magazines revealed that the film was on the floors within weeks of the war's announcement and moved towards completion as the aftershocks of war reverberated through the public. As I tried to trace this film through film magazines, I came across a discourse characterized by silences, what Adhira Mangalgiri has termed the ellipses of India-China history, things silenced, omitted, or illegible, the unspoken and the unspeakable. The period of 33 days roughly spans 2 issues of Filmfare, the English language fortnightly published from Bombay. Yet Filmfare's Diwali issue, coming 10 days after the announcement of the war, maintains a conspicuous silence on the ongoing emergency. The magazine's puzzling editorial silence continues in its next issue, dated November 16th, which, printed close to the ceasefire, devotes its editorial to the vociferous tendencies and personal and petty rivalries in the industry. Filmfare's discussion of the infighting in the industry is remarkable only for the magazine finding it worthy of an editorial during a full-scale war. Its silence gestures at a recalibration of silence and sound in the public sphere, the quietening of any voices already much dwindled by 62, speaking of the possibility of continued relations between India and China, and an amplification of cries of betrayal and suspicions of India's neighbor to the east. In short, Filmfare's silence may suggest meaning to be found in looking in the pointed silences of historical record. The war was announced to the Indian public through a radio broadcast by Jawaharlal Nehru on October 22, 62. Overwhelmed by vast numbers and artillery, Indian troops had received heavy setbacks and perished under attack by the Chinese army and extreme weather conditions. Through the 50s, allegations of naive idealism had been leveled against the critics of India's China policy on the account that India was relying on the uncertain assurances of Panchsheel and not embarking on a sufficiently ambitious militarization plan. The editorial silence of FinFare must be understood in the context of a public sphere rent by confusion and ambiguity. FilmFare's November 16th issue finally acknowledges the war on an inside page, printing reactions to the war by Bombay's leading film stars. Wahida Rahman was scanning every paragraph, every line of the newspaper, while the radio, normally used for the purpose of music like a gramophone, in her colleague Nanda's home, had become a constant source of news bulletins. None of the stars featured in FilmFare's mid-November issues made overt references to awkward political issues. None would mention Nehru except Nanda. Only actor Raj Kapoor wondered at the failure of peace and non-alignment to prevent the war, remarking a little sadly that a country like India, quote, championing the cause of peace, should have a war at its doorstep with a nation which has until recently been a very friendly neighbor. The figure of the Indian Jawan, imperiling his life, had captured the sympathy and imagination of the Indian public and the stars. Devanand, the star and producer of Tere Ghar Ke Samne, met army men on their way to the front, decided to make a film on their lives. He described two officers, a Bengali and a Punjabi, sitting side by side in a jeep, two human beings sharing the same car, going towards the same goal, thinking the same thing. He adds, this unity of purpose and thought is what India requires, and the army has it. This thought is echoed also by his contemporary Dilip Kumar, who calls for strict discipline in thought and action. Such a unity of purpose and thought was arguably greatest in the context of a public sphere seething with questions and rent with confusion. By November, news of the shooting of Tere Ghar Ke Samne in Shimla, Chandigarh, and Delhi would begin featuring in film magazines. Little was revealed of the film story, except that it was the latest Navketan offering with its star and co-founder Devanand in the lead with Nutan and the youngest Anand brother Vijay Anand directing the film. The excitement of the crowds for the upcoming film Star Attraction would be replicated in its publicity. Magnet attracts iron pieces, Devanand attracts cinema goers, with Anand's face in the foreground encircled by a horseshoe magnet with milling crowds pictured in the backdrop. Tere Ghar Ke Samne's production spans a temporal cusp, bridging the time before, during, and after the war. In a highly charged external context, I surmise the war exercised no small pressure on its publicity and, as I will argue, its narrative. As the film would continue production into the first half of 1963, its advertisements begin to appear side by side with discussions of the war among film-going publics. The film's publicity materials sidestep any resonance with the war, emphasizing the romantic theme instead. A strikingly enigmatic advertisement, however, would feature a man walking a tightrope suspended above jagged mountains with the caption, "The man who cannot afford to make a mistake says," that Navketan's Tere Ghar Ke Samne is a hit. The advertisement presents an interesting juxtaposition, preemptive assertion of the film's anticipated commercial success, alongside an admission of precarity. Made on capital borrowed from private money lenders at high interest rates, films were pre-sold to distributors who in turn, quote-unquote, sold them to exhibitors. Financially precarious and competing for exhibition spaces, the producer bore the primary risk of the film, in this case, Navketan or Devanand himself. The pressures of industrial organization and commercial enterprise dictated Hindi cinema's form and generic choices, as well as ensured limits to overt ideological agendas. It is not difficult to infer how the film must have been subject to industrial compulsions alongside the added pressures of public perception on a polarizing issue of recent vintage. Vijay Anand made a singular reference to this connection fleetingly in a 2001 interview. In his reply to the interviewer's question about the filming of a romantic song set in Delhi's Qutub Minar, Anand replied with an apparent non sequitur. Momentarily digressing from his explanation about the explication of love through the architecture of the Qutub Minar, he added, the film is set and shot in Delhi just after the India-China war. So the story of Tere Ghar Ke Samne is about two neighbors who fight with one another. It is hard to know if these ellipses, the only one in the entire text of the interview, indicate a pause for reflection or an abridgment, but the phrasing is interesting for the relationship it suggests between the film and the war. That the film is not about the war, but about neighboring in the shadow of war. My effort, therefore, is not directed at establishing the film as a war allegory, but to probe it as a tenuous analogy for fractured neighborly relations. A detail that seems almost incidental in this description forms a key component in my understanding: the film's locatedness in Delhi. The film's plot bears looking at before moving ahead. Lala Jagannath, played by comedian Om Prakash, and Seth Karamchand, poet and actor Harindranath Chattopadhyay, incidentally also the author of the poem that later became the slogan Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai in the 50s, instigate a heated bidding war for a plot at a property auction in New Delhi. Lala Jagannath bags the land at an astronomical price, and Seth Karamchand purchases the rear inferior plot for an even higher amount in a fit of pique. And so the feuding men become feuding neighbors, determined to build bigger and better homes to outshine each other's. Their plans are foiled when architect and son of Lala Jagannath and the daughter of Karamchand fall in love. What's worse, both sides select Rakesh to design the homes and unknowingly settle on the same design. Both sides thus end up with homes that are a mirror image of each other, foiling any plans for competition. The film's warp and weft lie in its interweaving of the story of young love with neighborly coexistence. Nested within each other, it is hard to say if the film is about a young couple in love or the old men at war. What is clear is that one communion is impossible without the other, and so the film presents an impassioned defense for the need of resolving neighborly conflict at a time when the appeal is complicated by the recent war. The parallel tracks of connubial and neighborly communion reach a crisis when Rakesh and Sulekha decide to organize their wedding together with the inauguration of the new homes, with wedding cards having been sent out to Delhi's highest political and social elites, including the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and in a pointed reference to the Cold War, the ambassadors of USSR and the US. The parents are presented with an inescapable fate accompanying. As the guests begin to arrive, the men are finally moved towards reconciliation through the persuasions of Rakesh. I'll play a little clip here about how he convinces the fathers, though he does it all through the film. But this is at the end. The main thrust of this argument rests not on the acceptance of young love, but a comprehension of the objective and unchangeable reality of geographical closeness, the shared existential relationship between neighbors. The idea of modernity here is in being in a constant pace with time, framing neighborly coexistence as a demand of the changing times. Oh, sorry. The only direct reference the film makes to the war is in a banter between the lovers at the boundary wall the night before the wedding. In his reply to Sulekha's doubt about the father's continued intractability, Rakesh replies, Panchsheel is an oddity in a breezy romance film, unless we factor in that the film's main conflict and resolution rests in the problem of neighbouring, suggesting a purchase for these ideas outside of policy and statesmanship. For a film invested in modern futures and a break from tradition, Rakesh's examples in this romantic scene detour to historical continuity with an exalted, non-violent past, Buddhist, biblical, and nationalist. Characteristic of Nehruvian thought, this narrative of non-violent history claimed moral authority from the past, or it re-narrativized history for the uncertain present. This refashioning and appeal to an ancient past emerged in response to deeply modern anxieties, the World War, the atomic bomb, the dissolution of empires, and the fragility of post-colonial nations in a Cold War world. The published literature of Panchsheel also insists on its practical use over philosophical ideals, putting history to discursive ends while pushing for non-militaristic paths of engagement. Historian Sunil Purushottam argues that such a discursive operationalization of history was geared at attempts to create a third part at Bandung and a renewed push towards the internationalist project of Third World. In the immediate post-war moment, however, the discursive hold of this historical narrative was fragmenting. The exceptional mention of China signals a shift of militaristic pragmatics replacing the narrative of non-aggression. The Filmfare November issue carries a curiously phrased quote by Dilip Kumar. We must prove to ourselves, if not to others, that the fabric of our thousands of years old society, despite a few tears, is strong enough to withstand this mockery of time, the Chinese invasion. The Chinese have provided us with an excellent opportunity to plunge into modern times. Emphasis mine. The phrase mockery of time again invokes a post-war crisis processed in the temporal realm. The phrasing seems to imply that India had somehow failed to be sufficiently modern, and the war would become the historical means to push her in that direction. I argue that the film transposes this discursive negotiation of temporality, this refashioning of historical pasts, the present, the idea of the future, to its exposition of a Delhi moving from the old to the new. For now, returning for a closer look at the secular architectures of these homes. We see modern futuristic design, curving homes with cantilevered balconies, long vertical windows opening towards each other like two parts of a whole. Their boundaries joined at the center, spatially uniting the feuding neighbors. This reorganization of space forces a state of constant encounter of their neighboring over avoidance of conflict. These are not homes of memory and intimacy, they are homes of the future, accelerating into post-partition and post-war modernity, or as Dilip Kumar put it, plunging into modernity, a fantasy of urban design seeking a break from the past. A closer look at the image, however, reveals a composition not entirely bereft of the past. A long shot places the homes in the foreground, opening towards each other. Moving our sight further back, however, reveals painted domes and minarets far in the background. The temporal imagination at play presents a visible and vibrant present with the backdrop of a passive, even romantic past, or to return to Dilip Kumar's words, history at the moment of a plunge into modernity. It is a future with a pliable historical backdrop rendered in the abstractions of painting. In this form, the Delhi of this film presents a pliable, temporally composite language of landscape of pasts, presents, and futures, addressing both the ruin, loss, and displacement of the old, and the expansion, development, and resettlement of the new. Studio shooting was an industrial necessity for a Bombay-based company making a film set in Delhi. In November, the crew of Tere Ghar Ke Samne conducted an outdoor schedule in Shimla via Delhi and Chandigarh and expedited an itinerary of 3 singular landscapes with historic and symbolic importance. Shimla, the idyllic colonial summer capital, is incidentally the site of the failed 1914 tripartite conference between the British, Tibetans, and Qing China, which led to the demarcation of the McMahon Line, an agreement that was not an agreement, quote unquote, demarcating a border that was not an agreed border, eventually leading to the events of 62. En route to Shimla, Rakesh passes through Chandigarh, the modernist new capital of post-partition Punjab, designed by Le Corbusier, a symbolic urban design experiment that processed partition trauma as if in a void of history and memory, an unflinching plunge into modernity. The film, however, does not situate action in Chandigarh, reserving its contemplation of architecture and temporality for Delhi. So why Delhi? As all of us who are from Delhi know, it is a city with history at large, a long past that lies between existence and erasure, memory and forgetting. Empty plots provide an imaginative canvas on which breaks from history can be attempted. The move from what is today old to New Delhi was one such break. After crushing the rebellion of 1857, the English dismantled Shahjahanabad, the bustling narrow lane city as it stood across the Red Fort, beginning the decline of the city and of Delhi-based Indian Islam. Clearing ground to the south of Shahjahanabad, the English made a claim to modernity with New Delhi designed by Lutyens, an imperial capital constructed in the style of the Grand Manor, at the center of which stood the Viceroy's house. Delhi witnessed a third violent shift in 47 when large part of the city's Muslim population migrated to Pakistan and a large influx of refugee migrants arrived. This post-independence, post-partition, yet newer Delhi expanded in planned and unplanned ways to accommodate its new residents. In 1963, Delhi was thus a city of new neighbors in new spaces, undergoing a reorganization of land, property, and dislodged social relations. Parcels of land were carved out and auctioned for residences as new colonies were established. This is a picture of South Delhi, where the action of the film is located. The opening shots, however, use the landscape of Delhi as a historiographic device, specifically to narrate a history leading up to the war. The motif of the old and the new, the historical and the modern, are echoed in the starting credits of the film. In quickly passing vignettes, the busy city rushes past both the old and the new. As if in a bioscope show, we see the Indian flag on the Red Fort, a symbolic resumption of national rule from Mughal forebearers, King Edward's equestrian statue as it once stood serving the Mughal fort after 1857. The film's title then appears with a different Delhi on each of its sides. On the left, a colonial building stands beside a busy road, while the remains of an old monument stand frozen in time on the right. History and modernity standing in front of each other. Indian Parliament, next King George V beyond India Gate, juxtaposed with the 16th century Lal Darwaza on the bottom right, the American Embassy with its facade of sculptured lace, the top of a tomb, I think it might be Humayun's, a road along a market area that is harder to identify, perhaps Daryaganj, Kashmiri Gate, Ashoka Hotel, Jama Masjid. Towards the end of it, the credits we see the old with its slow pace of life. A Tonga stands with its horses, Malishwalas administer massages to patrons, I think, in Edward Park. A man naps on the grass in the park. The breezy pace of the credits in Delhi's singularly saturated landscape make the job of recognizing each structure difficult. The thematic thrust, however, is easier to recognize. The old and the new in the movement of history. One can almost imagine the crew setting off from old Delhi and moving southward towards the newer Delhis. Driving the urgency of this plunge into modernity, however, is the India-China war. And so the final sequence of the opening credits changes from images to signposts, a synopsized historiography made of road names from the Lutyens area, pre-colonial dynasties followed by nationalist movement, Kautilya Chandragupta, Ashoka Prithviraj, Akbar Aurangzeb, Tilak Motilal Nehru, drawing a historical lineage from Buddhism all the way to the nationalist movement, a single thread of history with nonviolence at its heart. The film finally brings us to the area earliest to be developed in post-independence Delhi, Chanakyapuri, or the diplomatic enclave. The ideals of the international system, named after Chanakya's principles, flash by: Niti Marg, the road of policy; Shanti, the road of peace; Nyaya Marg, the road of justice; and finally, we see Panchsheel Marg, the road of Panchsheel, right before the film opens to the bidding war. The question of Panchsheel bookends the film's narrative. It organizes the beginning and the end, and so the war between the neighbors in the film is confronted with the question of Panchsheel, and Panchsheel itself historicized among a series of contexts establishing the historical stakes. Panchsheel re-inscribed historical pasts into modern foreign policy. Buddhism provided a discursive edifice of nonviolence at the heart of a modern problem of the management of post-colonial neighborships, the tenuous reliability of which fractured in the war, an overtaking of historicization by the events of history, an imagination of history that the war would open to contestation. This is a question that a reader of Filmfare writes to I.S. Johar. Non-violence, non-cooperation, non-alignment, what next? Nonsense. Imagining a future requires fashioning a past. Plunging into new modernity would require the fashioning of new histories, moving away from non-violence into a post-war militaristic order. I end with this quote from Mother India editor Baburao Patel, who would trace the same genealogy of the failure of nonviolent thought from Buddha to Jainism through to Gandhi and Nehru. Historical narratives would be supplanted with Hindu nationalist revisions as the ideological alternative to ideas like communism. We are suffering from the chronic disease of peace and nonviolence since the days of Buddha, a disease that has failed to infect the Chinese, as if these two isms had left something undone. We are blessed with Gandhiism, with non-injury, non-violence, non-cooperation, and non-whatnot. And now we have Nehru with Panchsheel, coexistence and non-alignment. Nehru or Napoleon actually said this in Lok Sabha. I am free to confess to this house that my soul reacts against war anywhere. This is the training I have received throughout my life, and I cannot easily get rid of it at the age of 72. We turn around and ask Nehru, if we are guided by the reactions of your soul, how are we to drive out the Chinese without a war with them? So yes, I end my presentation here. But in all, through this film, it's been a confusing ride trying to write this paper, and I welcome all your comments. At some point, I thought I was doing a paper that was about Delhi, but then I realized it was maybe about the writing of histories. But yes, so yeah, I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Navnidhi. Sorry for that pause. Megha, I can see that there weren't many questions in the chat box per se. Anand said to everyone that that was a good one, but what was a good one? Anand, where are you? Could someone unmute Anand? Yes.
Okay, thanks. No, I was actually looking at that dialogue which was happening between Nutan and Devanand in that particular scene. How he was describing the Chinese and the English way. So that was the good one. So.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Anyway, great presentation.
Thanks, Anand.
Yeah,
if I may,
yes.
like that dialogue is the perfect. Maybe it shows very well what this film does or what a commercial film can do when dealing with a heavy topic. In the way that it winds this entire story of the war. There's a part where I was, I think about this. Is this a film about these warring neighbors, or is this a film about these young people in love? But what it does is it nests one story inside another. And so Panchsheel just becomes about, these people and their love together. So yeah.
Now, Megha, I didn't think there were any more questions in the chat box. So would anyone like to come in at this point and make a comment? Raise hands.
Yes, Professor Obera, there is no question has been posted in the chat box yet. So I would request the participants if they raise their hand to ask questions.
Okay, plenty of questions there. Shall we just move from left to right? Aram Ashraf, would you like to come in now? Can you unmute yourself, or can someone unmute you, please? Is it possible for someone to unmute the room? Erin, I think if you could put your question in the chat box, let us pass on to Professor Mahanti and see what he has to say. Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you. That was indeed a great presentation. I was, in fact, the conclusion does make the present times, the last 10 years, and how New Delhi has again changed in a new milieu, which is being discussed in India as India with a strong leadership and so on, a powerful India and so on. Now, keeping that in mind, when you see the various stages, and your formulation is excellent, the messing of old and new. What I found in the movie or the discussion on the movie, not prominently concerned with is the colonial dimension. It is old and New Delhi. It is, I think, how the colonial policies, the colonial era, and the colonial architecture intervened in such a way that the autonomy of various other processes was heavily limited or seriously affected. So if you bring in the colonial dimension, then this the ridiculing of Panchashil and non-alignment by some has to be put in a different context. It is not one of a simple choice between war and peace, but a perspective on how to approach differences, tensions among neighbors, and yes, the faith in love does generate some new resources. So what I'm asking is, do you think the colonial dimension and the full comprehension of its implications will bring some other aspects to this discussion? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Professor Mohanty. It was, I think that is something I myself need to think about more. And because in terms of how to put that that conversation into interlocution with the film itself, there was a part I had, which I cut out because my paper was overlong, was that the way, if I'm thinking about historiography, the way the film shows us the history, the course of history in the beginning, very clearly what is missing in that history, we go from Mauryan to Chauhans, to Mughals, and then to the nationalist movement. And what it is showing actually is that it's kind of the architecture of Delhi is, and why don't we see any colonial names in that? Why is that history silent? It's because they re-inscribed road names with after 47, what they did was in the Latvian area, they re-inscribed the road names into the road names of a historiography projecting a history of India as understood, right? So in that way, it becomes the silent, it is the colonial powers that built this New Delhi, that give it its ways of being, as you said, the architectures, and yet they are the silent presence in a story of India and China. And yeah, that's excellent food for thought for me as well, to think about how that could be put into conversation in this particular topic. And I thank you. I would also be open to any suggestions or, in any way to kind of how one should think about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now there's.
Hi, can you hear me now? Hello? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, so this is Erin here.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so thank you for unmuting me. So I just wanted to say I really enjoyed that presentation. It's not an area which I have an expertise in terms of movies, but it is an area which I am interested now in the past, I was aware of the popularity of Indian movies in China, for example. So my work with the Uyghurs, one of the things I came across was the popularity of movies such as Avara, Raj Kapoor. So it was pertinent you actually mentioned Raj Kapoor there and how they were huge fans of the movie. And then reflecting on the movie you've chosen, Tere Ghar Ke Samne. And by the way, the whole time you were talking, the background song was running in my mind the whole time for this particular movie because I really like it. But then I also thought, the scene you had chosen with Dev Anand trying to talk to the dads, for example, for some reason, it reminded me of the scene from the movie Gone with the Wind. I don't know if you've seen the movie. There's a scene where Clark Gable kind of talks with the hero kind of talks to the warring factions, if you may like, and raising and I thought, well, I wonder if you could find parables and in a way I was thinking the same thing. What about comparing the movie you've chosen with others? Would that help kind of explain or emphasize, certain points that you are making in terms of the impact of the movie, apart from its commercial sense, I suppose. I don't know if I'm making sense to you, but this is like random thoughts going in my mind at the moment. So yeah, so congratulations on your work. It's really fascinating. Really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Last we got to hear from you after all that long wait.
Thank you for that, Hiram. I think what you say is, to begin with, when I started this project, I actually thought I was going to write a history of Indian films in China, except COVID happened and I had to shift, my sources from India. And it took me a really long time to even be able to articulate what I was writing anymore. But as to your point about Raj Kapoor, there is so much, it's a really painstaking process because nothing is ever digitized. So there's no, OCLC but Raj Kapoor through the 50s and many others are hosting delegations. It's kind of like cinema being used or the industry being used as a diplomatic pit stop almost, as it were. So, they were involved in some tangential way to these kind of diplomatic overtures that were being done. And that's why I find Raj Kapoor really fascinating too. There was a film delegation that you may know about already because some people have written about it, who go to China in 55, but his father Prithvi Raj Kapoor heads that delegation. Raj never goes. I believe, yes, and it becomes, Avara becomes a huge hit in the 50s and again in the 70s. When China reopens and they have a lack of films to show, so they replay these films. from earlier, and he gets another chance, I believe, in now, and I don't believe I ever saved that source, but in the 80s, someone offers it to him, hey, how about going to China? But he never does, because he feels like his face is too changed from how they remember him. So, that never comes to be. In terms of what you say about Gone with the Wind, it would be great to have other films to think about, but I have not come across any that I can compare in a way that would be most productive and fruitful. I think I've also been a little bit like, I maybe haven't thought hard enough about this, but one commonality, I think, and particularly with Gone with the Wind and this one, I think, is in the power of the male superstar, because in this film as well, as the producer and as the main lead, it is Devanand who gets the privileged position of making things happen. Every monologue is his, everything, it is his to solve the problem. So, that is one thing that just off the top of my head, I think intersects between these two examples. But yes, I do think I could benefit from thinking more about comparable films, and thinking about in what ways those comparisons could be most fruitful for this one. But thank you. Thanks for your question and for your kind comments.
I see that Ravi Bhuttalingam has his hand up. Can I ask him to speak?
Thank you, Patricia. Navnidhi, this was a very fascinating presentation and very, very thought-provoking. Thank you for the way you put it across. I have 3 questions. So I'll just explain all of them, and then you can answer in whichever order you like. One is, I found it very interesting about these 2 old men, the owners of the 2 properties. Just perhaps I lost a little bit of the thread of the background. So did these 2 old gentlemen have a pre-existing rivalry in the movie? Or did it start with their bidding for the 2 plots and properties? And continuing the same question, were the plots equal, or had someone put unequal plots? In other words, did one of them or the other of them, or both, feel shortchanged in the size of the property they got, and hence their rivalry, or was it pre-existing? So that is question number 1. Question number 2 is the young people who are in love. And when you're in love, then you have a feeling of 100% trust, right? You may not start on that, but you move to that. So you totally trust the other person. And likewise. So the word trust, to my mind, is something which is indivisible. You can't have a sort of 73% trust. Say if you're having an operation for heart surgery, you can't say, I trust my surgeon 86%. Whereas the older folk in this situation, who have a little more of a distant relationship as neighbors, maybe they are thinking of something like a confidence level rather than trust. With confidence, you can say, okay, as I get to know the person, I can build up my confidence. Today, he's 70%, maybe he'll become 80 and 85 and so on. It's measurable. That's the second question. And the third is that in this story, you have the older generation and the younger, and therefore each party, as it were, the father and daughter on one side and the father and son on the other, are, as it were, in one dimension in 2 camps, but the 2 youngsters are together, So there's a interest in each other's camp, and this younger element then convinces the older element to say, okay, you must be modern and you must settle all this and so on and so forth. So where is that parallel in your mind? Transpose it to the India-China context. Is that a hint or something that within these two countries there is a sort of an intent, latent, whatever it is, that is struggling against another intent and needs to come up, just like these youngsters have made. So this is just a speculations. These are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Bhuthalingam. So I'll get to them. The two old men, did they have a pre-existing rivalry? This is one of the most interesting things about this film. Yes, they do. They walk into the bidding war with a pre-existing, I mean, they walk into this bidding of plots that's going on, and they already dislike each other. There is a pre-existing rivalry. It is almost a mystical pre-existing rivalry because the film never tells us what it is. It does not feel the need to it. They are just two hostile feuding men, petty and egoistic. And it's almost, I mean, this is an extrapolation from my end, but almost as if the film says, well, you know, when two people fight, do you even need to know why they fight? They, you know, that in itself is a self-perpetuating kind of fighting that's going on. But where do they, I mean, these pasts that are invisible, right? Where do they come from? Are they coming from Lahore? You know, where do these rivalries come from? And then therefore, these new spaces that they're going to live in, these new modern homes, that these new secular spaces of newness that are going to reconfigure these relationships, almost as if there is no history to be resolved. It is just the present and a future going from here. So, so yes, that's a long answer and convoluted to what you were asking, but we don't know what the pre-existing rivalry is, but it exists. Are the plots equal? No, so Om Prakash, Lala Jagannath, the father of Devanand, gets the plot they were both bidding for is the front plot, the relatively superior plot. And then Harindranath Chattopadhyay walks out of there, but then feels very piqued, walks in and then buys the rear plot, which is an inferior plot, for more money than what the better plot went for, just to show him down. And so then he goes home and then he tells his family and they say, but our house is going to be hidden behind his house. And there's this, this amazing scene, this wonderful scene where he stands back to back with his wife and he says, okay, now you tell me, am I in front of you or are you in front of me? Which is to say that if we build our architectures in an antagonistic enough way, we never even have to see the other person. Whereas, through the trope of architecture, the film kind of brings them together in a facing position at all moments. These curved houses almost, almost like a two parts of a whole. But yes, and also resolves the problem of no plot ever being the rear plot or the inferior plot. They are equally, they are equal plots in size, at least. To your second question, the young people, the trust is 100%, the older folk, a confidence level, right? The building of a confidence level. The film really does attempt this throughout. So Devanand being the architect, he goes from, building the building of one house, runs over to the other house and tries his best to talk to both of them about how the other person may not actually be so bad. And in each case, he is shut down by both of them in the exact same language and logic of hostility. It's not only the other houses mirroring, but the men are completely mirroring, despite the fact that they physically look really different. One is, rotund and rustic, and the other one, and portly, and the other one is really whippersnapper thin and kind of urbane, and yet everything they have to say is exactly the same as the other person. So the film resolves this. There is no way. They refuse to talk. There is no intent. Actually, I'm just mixing this with question 3, right? There is no interest. There is no intent. And then the film takes it through these young people from a 0 to 100, arguing for just love between your neighbor, just because you cannot avoid a neighbor. Just on the basis of that existential relationship. And there is a scene that I didn't show because I thought it was getting too long. And he says, actually, you are both the same. You are frogs in a well. You are like brothers. And this is something a friend of mine once pointed out to me, that, the Hindi chini bhai bhai, there are gradations of relationships, right? There's brothers, there is friends, there is neighbors. And so the film brings them to neighbors, right? Like you may be in one version of events brothers, or in another version of events at least try to be friends, but what you cannot avoid is being neighbors. And that is the objective reality of their existence. So yes, I hope I answered somewhat your questions.
The bit about the lovers being embedded in the family of the quarreling fathers. That is, there's one agent in each camp, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, Miss Sharma, there is a comment and a question posted in chat box. So a very interesting and incisive analysis of a clearly political film actually. But are there any other films that fall in a similar category? Asked by Sri Ram Natarajan.
Thank you, Sriram. Any other films that fall in a similar category? I actually think this film, there can be no other. Simply because, can I maybe, if I look harder, find a film that may allegorize India-China? Actually, it would take me a long time. But the reason I say this is a film unlike any other, is because this film, when we think about the filmmaking process, it takes a few months. And this film is being baked just as the fallouts of this war are also kind of reverberating through the public sphere. So it absorbs, I feel, this war and this conflict in a way that I think no other one can, especially since it takes for its subject the problem of neighboring. I can't think of another film that is in a similar category. A film that is we would call that a family romance, that then takes up something that in a tangential way or in some way speaks to India, China. It's hard to come by that particular genre.
Thank you, Ms. Sharma. There is another question that, as you mentioned, that Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was taken from a poem written by Harindranath. What were his reactions post-war around the time of the release of this film? Thank you.
Thank you. I've looked long and hard for something Harindranath Chattopadhyay had to say. I know that he was translating Mere Vatan Ke Logon into English because he was also a poet. And that was being published by film magazines. I see his interviews as well around the film, around the shooting of the film. But his reactions to the war, even I'm also on the lookout, and I'm still looking. I've looked, it's surprising, but I have never come across an autobiography or anything of the sort. There was something I thought was going to be there around the 72 or 73 that he may have written. You know how when you do Google Books and you're trying really hard to find like to put two things together, like Harindranath Chattopadhyay, China, Hindi, Chini. And you see the tantalizing 3 lines and you try your hardest to find something, but it never, and then I went through, yes, but the short answer is sadly, no. I'm on the lookout still, but thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Verma. There is another question from William Fuse. Since this film was under production at the time of war's outbreak, are there any indications if the production changed while the war was underway? Another question from William Fuse also. Does this film speak to participants? 1 second. Does this film speak to partisan beyond general neighborliness towards each other? Thank you.
There are 2 questions there. I think if you can answer one at a time.
Yes, thank you. So are there any indications that the production changed while the war was underway? No, because it's not, like I said, the film sidesteps any reference to the war in its publicity. I mean, we would only know if the people who were involved in the making of this film could tell us. But outside of that, there's really no way to know. But there are interesting contradictions within the film itself. For example, when the wedding cards go out and they read it out for us, it's a date in May. But then the night before the wedding, they sit together and he does that thing where he makes that, there's 2 ways, Indian and Chinese come in and bam, 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 bam. That's definitely post November. So it is either that the film was being done, and the filmmaking takes a long time. So is it that the film was partially made and they, how did that happen? Or did they on purpose put in like a confusion just so the film doesn't get too attached with the war? We have no way to know, unfortunately. Does the film speak to partition beyond general neighborliness? So my thinking around this is that in a way, the history of India and China needs to be thought of as a post-partition history as well. Not just a history of India and China alone, but a history that is inflected deeply by the experience of partition. And so this, even just the theme of neighborliness then becomes a theme of neighbors on either side, really. But yeah, how do we envision a post-partition history of India and China? That's the question for me, but not a question I've answered yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sharma. There are some participants have raised their hands to ask questions.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Kamania Tadani has been trying in the chat box many times and now with hand up. Could we have that question, please, or set of questions? Can someone help there, please?
Yeah, Patricia, can I come in?
Rabbi, okay, if you can be let in, that would be wonderful. Something seems to be keeping people out.
No, I was
Yes, you go ahead.
trying to unmute, and it is unmuted. Thank you, Navneeta. The only I have that when you talked about this 2 old men and their rivalry, do you see any parallel to the what was going on in the early 50s, or the thinking of the left about the overall international situation? These two old men maybe were thinking about or representing in some ways the uh, the British don't come in that way, but the old order of the colonial masters and the newly emerging countries, or any other sequel for this, or any influence of this film on any of the other India China or India Pak films. Can you imagine? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'll take the second question first. Influence of this film on any other sequel or any other films? I don't think so. I think this film, it comes out, and even before it comes out already, even the company itself, Navketan, is onto their other bigger international project, which is Guide. So it's kind of a minor movie. It's never mentioned in the autobiographies of any of the Devanand has an autobiography. Vijay Anand has a biography. It's never mentioned. Vijay Anand mentions it in one interview saying, I made a small comedy film. It was a film they moved past really quickly. And before you know it, Guide was on the sets. It was an international project. It was bigger. And it just kind of recedes into the Navketan filmography as this minor romance and comedy that no one really thinks about or reworks in any way. Neither Navketan nor, as far as I know, any other company. I could be wrong. I might be missing something, but certainly none with the kind of India-China context to it, quite in this way. To your first question, the old men and their rivalry, is there a parallel to the early 50s, the histories of the left? If they are representing the old world order and the colonial masters, and here I'm reminded of Professor Mohanty's question as well, which I think I did not answer very satisfactorily either, is because I feel like I need to read up on in what ways I could think about this film in terms of the colonial architectures or of the older order that was present. So yes, thank you for that. I feel like there needs to be more thinking on my part here in terms of how to think about the colonial the way this film is not too far away from the colonial period or from those histories and its influence. So yes, I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that, but I hope in a future revision to be able to include something like that.
Shriram Natarajan, would you like to come over with your comment?
Karmani Thandani, are you there? You are a co-host now. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Please go ahead. Thank you. Karmani Thandani, are you there? Yes, there is some issues on their side. So I would request other participant to ask their question. Anand
Am I
Prikishan, are you
audible?
there?
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
you are audible. Please. Thank you. Karmane Thandani, I guess there is some problem on your side, so I would request you to please post your question in the chat box. Will be answered. So I would request another participant to ask their question. Anand P. Krishnan, are you there?
Yeah, thank you. I hope if there is somebody else, I can also wait. So, or I can go ahead. Thanks.
Please go ahead, Anand.
Yeah, thanks, Navneet. That was a very interesting presentation. In fact, I was also remembering all those films, not just in Hindi, where neighborly relations were being talked about. So, so maybe just looking at the Hindi film world would be one way, but if one also looks at some of the other industries, I'm not sure whether we will also be able to find similar films and similar genre. So I had basically two questions. One was I was thinking, of course, you are talking about the fact that this is you are not showing this as a parable, but inevitably this kind of becomes a parable. So if that is the case, so how is the film, for instance, is there any literature on how the film was received in China? For instance, were they able to get some of these messaging? And especially, I mean, if you look at that that dialogue sequence between Devanand and Nutan, where Devanand is pushing that Indian line seems to be about non-violence and non-interference, but the Chinese are doing this. So how is this kind of received? If there is literature or is there any work available to look at that? The second is, it looks also from what you have also presented that this film seems to be the last in terms of offering any middle ground solutions or non-violent solutions as far as India-China is concerned. And immediately, I mean, the next year you have Hakikat coming. And of course, that's by Chetan Anand, this is by Vijay Anand, of course, but brothers, but under the same production house. So if you juxtapose both these films, uh, why do you think the narrative has completely changed? Is it because now there is a realization also among the production house and also among the director that the fact that the narrative in terms of good neighborly relations has changed and altered? So that's why you need to now completely move to the opposite direction. Of course, the films are also of different genres, but but this how do you measure this kind of change? I mean, there's this last push somehow for more negotiated way, but at the end of the day, it seems that this is not going to work out, and the Chinese are not going to understand. So how do you see this transition just in 1 year? I mean, one film moving to the other. So how is that? And also, were these films also taking parallelly? I mean, at least in terms of production, because films also take a lot of time to get completed and released. So were there both Hakikat and Tere Ghar Ke Samne also happening? The production was happening at the same time. So that just thanks, but thanks for that interesting presentation.
Thanks, Anand. Those are great questions. How was the film received in China? Now, after 62, there is only, in terms of just contemporary audiences, there is only how do films go to China, before the digital comes around. They go when you have a film week or something of the sort, right? So there's only that one shining star. 1955 is when a film week happens. That's when Avara, Dobi Gazamin, etc. are shown for the first time. But after that, and sure, you have some films that go through even after, but not quite in that big way that these films go in 1955 through film weeks all across China in different cities. By 63, however, and especially right after the war, there is no way this film would have traveled to China. But what you asked me makes me think about, did this film ever go, have Chinese audiences seen this film in recent years through digitally or, through the internet? That I'd never thought of even looking into that. I just, assumed, well, yeah, obviously nobody in China ever saw this film at the time of its release. But that's a great question that I need to go and look up and see if this film has ever been seen by any viewers in China whatsoever. To your second question, it seems to be the last kind of push in terms of offering nonviolent solutions and why the narrative changed. I think we can see the narrative shifting within this film as well. in that one scene where he does talk about Panchsheel, he does make an exception for China. And in that last slide where I talk about the way Babu Rao Patel is talking about nonviolence as well, I think the war itself shifted the narrative. This film it's almost like it's built on shifting sands. And that's why even in this film, you can almost see the change. And then Hakikat, of course, changes. You go away from the idea of neighboring to the idea of war between Hakikat and this film. What you point out is really interesting, right? This is Vijay Anand and Devanand make this one. Chetan Anand, the older brother, makes Hakikat. They are not both from Navketan. Chetan Anand had left Navketan about 2 years before this film, around 1960. And Himalaya Films, that's his film company, that makes Hakikat. Hakikat gets on the floors just around January 63. February 63, and Chetan Anand then leaves Guide and goes to make Hakikat because he gets money from Chiron, the chief minister of Punjab, for Hakikat, and then Vijay Anand steps in to save Guide. So it's between these three brothers, they're kind of like juggling all these projects between them. The third kind of the third film that and these are all films I'll be talking about in my dissertation. The third really interesting film, not a great film, but an interesting film, is Prem Pujari, which comes all the way in 1970. But by then, the Pakistan war has also happened, and it's kind of like it's a mix of espionage and this and that and the other. But the central problem of the character played by Devanand is, should he be non-violent? Because he really does not want to be non-violent, but then he is pushed into non-violence. So nothing changes immediately, but the sands begin to shift with the war. And there is no purchase, it would seem, among the it seems, that there's an entire body of literature that says idealistic, naive, etc., etc. Nobody wants to hear anything. A war is incontrovertible proof of its own kind of centrality as a historical determinant, almost, right? So yeah, sorry, I think I gave you a very convoluted answer to that, but yeah, I think things begin to change even with this film.
Thank you. In fact, that info you told about how Chetan Anand moved out of Navketan was kind of new to me, so I didn't know that. So thanks for that. Maybe we may never be able to get a complete grasp on it. But I think there was an interesting trivia, because I think this is the last film where Nutan and Devanand have acted together. I think after that, I don't think both of them have shared screen space together. So yeah, thank you.
Megha, I think there are two people who've been left out repeatedly. One is Tadani, who stood aside and couldn't be unmuted. Can we get Tadani in now? Come on, you Tadani.
Actually, Professor Oberoi, there is no participants left for the question. So I guess it's the time to conclude the session. So
okay. Well, I think if other people can see the chat box, they will have seen one from Shri Natarajan as well, asking about similar productions from the Chinese side. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Professor Oberoi, I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Yeah.
So with this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank you, Ms. Navnidhi Sharma and Professor Patricia Oberoi, for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also offer our gratitude to the audience. The video of today's seminar shall be available on ICS's YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all the participants for the upcoming Wednesday seminar on 19th June 2024 at 3 p.m. IST. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Okay.
Thank you all for your questions and